Greetings, everyone. Dr. C here. I am pretend bringing you this week's lecture from St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican City in Rome. This is, of course, the home of the Pope. All right, let's get started. Today, I want to talk about socioeconomic class. And we're going to talk about economic inequality abroad and also within the United States. So if you remember, in our discussion of political anthropology, we talked about the concept of power, right? The ability to exert control over others, to be able to influence other people's decision-making. And in many ways, in the United States abroad, in the modern era, power is tied to wealth. And to be completely honest, it was always tied to wealth, but that has become more and more evident in the last 20 to 30 years. And the way that we think about power in terms of socioeconomic class is in terms of prestige and privilege. These are social resources that you have access to that reflect other people's respect for you and their willingness to be influenced by you. So we tend to divide societies into two different categories when it comes to socioeconomic class, and that is egalitarian versus ranked. In egalitarian societies, all members of society have equal access to resources, prestige, and power. Everyone is equal. That's why it's egalitarian. There are some inequalities in egalitarian societies, but they are very few. It's usually based on the same kind of factors as in ranked societies, issues like gender and background. But status is highly situational. That means if you have a higher status in society, that's because you've earned it by having access to the same resources as everyone else, but doing something extraordinary. In other words, some situation had to occur that conveys higher status upon you. You're not automatically given higher status because of where you fit into society. You have to earn some kind of higher status. So there are egalitarian societies around the world. There aren't any countries that really operate on an egalitarian level, but there are lots of subcultures or smaller social groups that behave as egalitarian. But most of us live in ranked societies, and most certainly the United States is a great example of a ranked society. People or kinship groups are ordered on a continuum of status. That means there are higher status individuals and lower status individuals, and higher status individuals have more access to wealth, prestige, opportunity, resources, etc. In ranked societies, the amount of freeness, when we talk about how free they are, part of what we're talking about is how many people have access to resources. So in highly ranked societies, really hierarchical societies, there is a clear ranking of who gets which access to which resources. But for example, America is a country where, for the most part, though we have a ranked society, most people have access to all resources. Like, if you have money, you can go to a store and purchase anything as long as you have the money to do it. There are more ranked societies where, oh, if you're of a certain socioeconomic class, you're not allowed to buy certain things, or you're not allowed to go into certain buildings or use certain resources. In the US, as long as you have wealth, you pretty much have access to everything. That being said, we have deep inequalities on who has access to wealth and how they're allowed to access that wealth. And that's why there's a lot of structural inequality in the US. But there are some ranked societies that are even more strict and stringent about what the royal family or top tribes are allowed to have access to, whereas other average citizens are not allowed to have access to those same resources. So again, ranked societies versus egalitarian societies. And then we also have that concept of the elite. Elites are members of the top social group in a stratified society. In a ranked society, they're the ones who are ranked more highly. And so they have more privileges, right? Privileges are those benefits that you gain from characteristics. And those privileges can be based on your race, right? White privilege. They can be based on your religion, right? In America, there's Christian privilege. They can be based on your gender. Most certainly, there's male privilege in the United States. They can be based on your social background, right? So I went to an elite university. I have certain privileges over my boyfriend who did not go to an elite university when it comes to the job market. All of us have privileges in some way. You're a college student right off the bat. That means you have a certain degree of privilege over people who don't have access to college education. Everybody has their privileges, but some people have more privileges than others. Those who have the most privileges, they tend to be the elites. So we, as economic anthropologists trying to understand socioeconomic class, look at social stratification. In other words, the structured inequalities between groups in society. So this means in socially stratified societies that, yeah, people have access to all resources, but not exactly. If you have a lot of money, it's easy to make more money. If you are part of a racial or ethnic group that social stratification in the US has basically meant you don't have the same access to education or other resources, then that builds long-term multi-generational problems with amassing wealth in communities, for example. So socially stratified systems have clear rankings. You know who's on top, right? In America, we know who the 1% is. We can tell by looking at the way that they spend their money. The ranks don't change that much. There's always been the wealthy in America. They have always been the ruling elite. And in socially stratified societies, that ranking matters. Like being poor in America, it makes a difference in your life versus being wealthy in America. In egalitarian societies where like everybody has relatively same amounts of wealth and same access to resources and everyone's the same, social status, your social status doesn't really play into your day-to-day life. People just don't think about it much. Everybody's egalitarian. But when you have heavy social stratification and you have clear layers between the haves and the have-nots, the 1% and everybody else, this directly affects the lives not only of the people who are in the 99%, but also of the uber wealthy who are in the 1%. Now, Marx, some of you may have read Karl Marx, but a lot of students have not. So just to give you the quick and dirty, right? Karl Marx argues that there are two social classes and that social class is not about wealth, social class is about access to resources. He argues that the upper class, which is known as the bourgeoisie, controls the means of production. It owns them. This can be land, company, resources, stocks, anything, right? And so the bourgeoisie are the ones who are able to turn that money into more money, right? A great example of this is Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon. That dude, basically every time he shits, he prints money. I mean, that dude has turned money and reinvesting money into Amazon into exponential growth, and he's going to be the world's first trillionaire. And that's the bourgeoisie, right? He owns the means of production. He owns the company. He owns the stocks in that company. He owns the resources that that company sells, etc. On the other hand, there are most of us, and we are the proletariat. We sell our labor for wages, and we work for the bourgeoisie. So I don't own a company. I don't own any land. I own some stocks, but other than that, I don't own any means of production. Rather, I sell my labor. People hire me as a consultant or as a professor or as a writer, and I sell my labor and they gives me the money, and then I spend that money on stuff, right? So most of us fit into the category of the proletariat. Few of us fit into the category of the bourgeoisie, but the bourgeoisie are the ones who have the wealth and use the wealth to make more wealth. The proletariat are the ones who sell their time, their labor, and their efforts to that wealth in order to help that wealth make more wealth. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about one form of social stratification, and that's the caste system. So a caste system is a type of society in which social levels are closed, and you are stuck in that social level. If you are born in the highest caste, you will marry someone else who's in the highest caste. All of your friends will be in the highest caste. You don't interact with people in the lower castes except that they serve you. It's set for life. If you are born into the lowest caste, that's it. You're fucked. If you're born into the laboring caste, you're going to be a laborer. If you were born a servant, you're going to be a servant. There's never an opportunity for economic advancement. There's never an opportunity for changing from one caste to another. So in caste societies, you must practice endogamy. Later this semester, we'll talk about different marrying patterns, but endogamy is where you marry someone within your own group. So if you are of the lowest caste, you have to marry someone from the lowest caste. You can't marry up, you can't marry down. So the strongest example of the caste system was in India. India for a long time, for like 1,000 years, had the caste system where the highest caste were priests and scholars, second highest were soldiers and warriors, third highest were merchants and professionals, and at the lowest were the laborers and servants. And like whichever caste you were born into, that's the caste that you had to marry into, and that's the caste that you had to live into. So if you were a woman and you were born, your father was a soldier and he was a member of the soldier caste, then you were destined to marry another soldier or some other kind of warrior. You had to marry within your caste, and you knew that your sons were going to become warriors and soldiers as well, and your daughters were going to marry warriors and soldiers within the caste, right? And so India no longer practices the caste system, although it still really does exist in many levels. And like a lot of Indians still choose to marry within their caste, even though they don't have to, even though they can marry outside of their caste. So it still has a strong influence on Indian life today. But for the most part, caste systems, we don't see them as often in the world now because we have the idea that if you are really talented and brilliant in a lower caste, you should be able to work your way up. You should be able to move up in the world. And so we've kind of moved away from caste systems and moved more into class systems, right? And so classes are where groupings of individuals are put together based on their socioeconomic experiences. And so you're either lower class, middle class, or upper class, or like today I would argue we even have like an uber upper class, which is like the crazy upper class. And classes are different than castes because you can change your class. Classes are fluid and they're dynamic, they're changing. What it means to be a part of the middle class today is not the same as what it meant to be part of the middle class 30 years ago or 60 years ago. And class systems are somewhat achieved. Now, this is not always the case. If you were born into uber wealth, it's pretty hard for you to like drop all the way to a lower class. But if you're in a lower class, you can work your way up to a higher class by achieving things, by earning money, by making it, right? Making it, that's what that means. Class is also not just based on status, it's actually based on economics, especially in the US. So it's not that just being born into a prominent family is enough. You actually have to have the wealth that goes along with it. And being born into a poor family that nobody's heard of, like you can work your way up. And like you can be Meghan Markle and be like a nobody born to like two nobody parents and work your way up to being like a princess and marry a prince, right? And that's because it's based on economics and social position and like working your way to that social position, not just, oh, you're born into a caste that's automatically given to you. And class systems are very impersonal. It's about the money, baby. If you make them Benjamins, then you can make it happen. In other words, it's not about where you necessarily are constructed on some kind of overarching system. It's your bank account. That's it. It's impersonal. It's dollar signs. That's the number. It doesn't matter whether we like you, whether we love you, whether we hate you. Like everybody hates Jeff Bezos. Everybody hates Mark Zuckerberg. It does not matter. The homeboys take it to the bank. They make the money. It's impersonal. It doesn't matter how much we like them. So we have two different perspectives, right? You can have your achieved status, and in the class system, it's emphasized, achieved status is emphasized in class. And that's where you get there based on merit and skill. You earn that money, you make that position. But there's also ascribed status that you just get by being born into who you are, and that's more connected to the caste system. So class has achieved, and caste has ascribed status. So if we talk about class in the United States, we tend to base class in the US on a couple of things. First, we base your socioeconomic class on your income, and your income and your wealth are not the same thing. And you guys are going to watch some videos for this week about income gaps and wealth gaps in America and why these wealth gaps occur, right? But income is based on the money that you earn. So your salary, your investments, your wages, that's your income. But you also have your wealth, the amount of money and wealth that somebody actually holds. So you have the amount of money that you have saved up in your bank account, that's your wealth. And the properties that you own, the material wealth that you own, that's your wealth. But then there's also how much you make a year, how much you earn a year. So someone can be a high income individual, they make a lot of money, but they have a lot of debt. For example, they just graduated from college. So they make a lot of money, but they also have a lot of debt. So they don't actually have very much wealth, right? These are often called Henrys, high earning, not rich yet. In other words, they have high income, but they're not yet wealthy, like people just out of law school. On the other hand, you can have individuals who are uber wealthy. They have a lot of material goods and they have a lot of money, but they don't actually earn anything. They don't actually have an income. Although in many cases, if they have a lot of wealth, they've invested it and then those investments make wealth, so they do have income. But they don't actually do anything for income, but they do have wealth. We also sometimes have educational attainment as an indicator of class. So I have a PhD that automatically gives me a certain degree of class in America, because when I introduce myself, I can introduce myself as Dr. Chloe Mulderig, like if I'm in a business meeting or I'm talking to a business client, and that automatically confers a degree of prestige and respectability upon me because I have educational attainment. So when you guys graduate from college, you will have a college degree that gives you a certain degree of like a higher class or socioeconomic attainment. And then finally, we have certain professions or occupations that are considered to be high class in the US. Again, these are associated with wealth. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to make a lot of money doing that high class position, but it's considered a high class position. So lawyers or doctors are considered high class positions. Even if you are a doctor who makes no money whatsoever because you work in a clinic helping poor people and you choose not to make any money, you donate your salary, or you make like $15,000 a year because you're working in a not-for-profit clinic, you're a doctor that still has a certain degree of class to it, even if you're not making the wealth that goes along with that. So much the same way, professors are an interesting position in America because they have a high degree of social class. We consider, oh, you're a professor, that's a very respectable position. But professors earn very little money in the United States. We actually earn less than school teachers in many cases. So it's a high class position, but it doesn't come with the high income that we normally would associate with high class. So when we think about poverty in the United States and poverty around the world, we have to realize that there's not just one concept of poverty. There is absolute poverty. Absolute poverty is literally being so poor that you cannot afford your minimum sustenance needs. And we are absolutely facing absolute poverty in this country. There are lots of countries around the world that experience absolute poverty on the regular, where there just aren't enough resources for people or people don't have enough money. A lot of people around the world live on $1 a day or $2 a day. But in the United States, we are seeing more and more people move to absolute poverty in the last year because of the pandemic. A lot of people have lost their jobs. This is why you see examples of lines for food banks wrapping around parking lots because people are in their cars and the lines go on for miles. We are at a point of absolute poverty for a lot of Americans who quite literally are not going to be able to feed their kids over the course of the winter, who have to send their kids to school where they aren't going to have enough food for them or meals for them, who are facing eviction, etc. But we also have the concept of relative poverty. And a lot of Americans live in relative poverty and don't understand this concept. That means being poor compared to the rest of your society, right? So there's absolute poverty, which is I just can't afford things. And that's just an absolute. But then there's also relative, which is comparative, right? You have to be able to compare. And so a lot of Americans who are middle class use relative poverty the wrong way. They look at the upper class, they look at the uber wealthy, and they go, well, compared to them, I'm really, really poor. So I must be really poor. Whereas if they compared themselves to people who are poorer than them in their society, they might suddenly go, oh, wait, actually, I'm middle class. Actually, I'm doing all right. Right? So relative poverty is also who you choose to compare it to and how you choose to think of it. And that's why in a lot of cases, a lot of countries have poverty lines, which are kind of standards so that you don't focus on relative poverty, you focus on absolute poverty. And so a poverty line is when a government sets a standard that says this is the absolute minimum to live a reasonable life in our country. If you're below that, you are at absolute poverty. Relative does not matter compared to anyone else. If you are below the poverty line, like you are not meeting the basic requirements, something is wrong. If you're above the poverty line, you at least have enough money to live. Then we can talk about relative poverty compared to others, but that poverty line shows us the absolute poverty level for a country. And when we talk about social class, we also talk about the concept of language. You can often identify people and their socioeconomic class based on the language they use. I experienced this when I went to college. I grew up in rural Pennsylvania, so I had a little bit of a Southern twang and had a lot of poor grammar in my language. When I got to Dartmouth, I was mocked by professors. I was mocked by classmates, most certainly. My peers were like, did you not learn how to speak growing up? And so I actually had to learn to change my accent, to learn to change my grammar structures so that I spoke more like my classmates. Middle class individuals in particular, I grew up lower middle class, do a lot of code switching. When we hang out with people of lower socioeconomic classes, we change the type of language that we use so that we fit in with them. And when we move to upper classes and hang out with our upper class friends, we switch our local or linguistic registers to match with them. Code switching is not unusual for people who belong to social minorities as well, people who belong to racial groups where they speak one way when they're speaking within their racial group, but they feel the need to code switch into a different form of English when speaking to people outside of their racial group. Code switching is very common. You probably will practice it at some point in your life. It is a powerful way of moving from one social class to another, or at least changing your performance of social class. Whew. Well, that was a long lecture. Thankfully, we got through it. Thanks so much for following along, and get ready for some very heated discussions in section this week as we tackle the issue of race and socioeconomic class in America. We're going to focus on the US in this week's discussions. I cannot wait. Thank you so much for listening.